All right, let's get right into it. India has gone all in on a new type of fuel called E20. You've probably seen it at the pump. It's petrol blended with 20% ethanol. Now, it's been rolled out with these huge promises of a cleaner planet and a healthier economy. But it has also kicked up a massive storm of controversy. And in this explainer, we're going to unpack exactly why. That's really the heart of it, isn't it? Is this the magic bullet for India's energy problems, or is it a policy that's actually creating a whole new set of headaches for millions of people, and maybe even for the environment? That's the big question we're digging into today. So, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the official promise of E20, why the government is so excited about it. Then we'll get into the problems drivers are actually facing. We'll examine the pollution trade-offs, calculate the real carbon footprint, look at some of the hidden environmental costs, and finally, explore what a better path forward might look like. Okay, so to really get this policy, you have to look at the big picture. From a national strategy point of view, this is about so much more than just the environment. We're talking about money, national security, and huge-scale economics. And the numbers here are just staggering. I mean, India imports something like 85% of its crude oil. That makes the whole economy really vulnerable to what's happening in global markets. So by blending in ethanol, the country is set to save over 43,000 crore rupees in 2025 alone. That is a massive step towards energy security. And here's the kicker. That money doesn't just disappear. A huge chunk of it gets rerouted right back into the Indian economy. You see, this policy creates this giant, stable market for crops, mostly sugarcane. We're talking an estimated 40,000 crore rupees paid directly to farmers for that feedstock in 2025. That is a game changer for the rural economy. And this quote really captures the government's entire vision. It's a really powerful concept, right? Taking farmers, the annadatas or food providers, and turning them into urja datas, energy providers. You're basically plugging the agricultural heartland directly into the national energy grid. On paper, it looks like a win-win-win. Yeah, a win-win-win on paper sounds great, but let's shift gears and look at what's happening in the real world. Because for millions and millions of vehicle owners, the story is, well, it's very different. They are the ones feeling the immediate and, let's be honest, often negative impact of this switch. And that's the real tension here. The high-level strategic benefits seem clear, but there is a huge disconnect with what's actually happening on the ground. You've got widespread complaints about vehicle performance, and it's making people ask, what is the real cost of this policy, and who's the one paying it? The number one complaint, by far, is mileage. It's simple physics. Ethanol has less energy than petrol, so your car is just not going to go as far on a liter of E20. Now, official reports say this loss is pretty small, maybe 2 to 6%, but just look at what real people are saying. Consumer surveys are showing mileage drops of anywhere from 6 to 20%, sometimes even more. That's a massive gap between the lap fests and the reality of the road. And it gets even trickier for what's called the legacy fleet, basically any car or bike made before April 2023. You see, ethanol can be corrosive. It can actually eat away at older rubber and plastic fuel lines. Using E20 might even void your warranty. And the worst part? The older, safer E10 fuel has just vanished from most pumps, so millions of owners have no other choice. This also creates this hidden carbon cost. You could call it a maintenance multiplier. If parts wear out faster, you have to replace them more often, and all that extra manufacturing adds up to more emissions over the car's lifetime. Okay, fair enough. The impact on drivers is clearly a big deal. But let's get back to the core environmental claim, that E20 is a cleaner burning fuel. And look, there's some truth to that, but it's not the whole story. It's really more of a trade-off. So the good news is that the oxygen in ethanol helps the fuel burn more completely. That's a fact. And it does significantly reduce nasty stuff like carbon monoxide and unburned hydrocarbons. But, and this is a big but, that exact same chemical process increases other harmful emissions. Specifically, you get more acetaldehyde, which is a likely carcinogen, and more formaldehyde, which is a major ingredient in creating smog. So it begs the question, are we really cleaning the air, or are we just swapping one kind of poison for another? That's a perfect question, and it brings us to what is probably the most critical part of this whole debate, the total carbon footprint. To get a real answer, you can't just look at the tailpipe. You have to look at the entire life of the fuel, from the moment the crop is planted to the moment it's burned in your engine. Right. So a fuel's life has two parts. First is well to tank. That's everything involved in growing the sugarcane and turning it into ethanol. And on this front, sugarcane ethanol is a clear winner. Studies show it creates up to 65% fewer greenhouse gases than making gasoline. That's a huge benefit. But that's only half the story. The second part is tank to wheel. That's the emissions from actually burning the fuel in your car. And this is where that mileage loss we talked about becomes the single most important factor. It's so important, in fact, that it can completely wipe out all those gains you made upstream. Let's walk through how this works, because it's fascinating. In the best case scenario, let's say a tiny 4% mileage loss, the upstream benefit of making ethanol is much bigger than the downstream penalty of burning a little extra fuel. The final verdict? You get a net reduction in carbon emissions. It works.
But now let's look at the real-world scenario. With a 15% mileage loss, that downstream penalty becomes massive because you have to burn so much more fuel just to go the same distance. The critical thing to understand here is that this penalty can get so big that it completely cancels out the initial benefit. You can actually end up with a net increase in carbon emissions per kilometer. This is the tipping point, and millions of older vehicles in India may have already crossed it.
And believe it or not, the carbon math isn't even the end of the story. The environmental ripples from this policy spread far beyond your car's tailpipe, reaching deep into India's farmlands and, critically, its water tables. And this brings us to one of the most jaw-dropping hidden costs: water. Sugarcane is an incredibly thirsty crop. Get this. To produce 1 single liter of ethanol, it can take as much as 3,630 liters of water. In a water-stressed country like India, that is just an enormous environmental burden to carry. This also plunges us right into the classic food versus fuel debate. When you divert crops like maize and sugarcane to make fuel, you're obviously reducing the supply that's available for everything else, like animal feed. And that shortage creates a direct ripple effect. The cost of animal feed goes up. So what happens? Wheat processors have to raise the price of staples like flour to cover their costs. This policy is, quite literally, making basic food more expensive for everyone. So, okay, it's pretty clear the policy has some serious, deep-seated problems. But it's not necessarily a lost cause. The source material we've been looking at is very clear on this. There are concrete, practical steps that could be taken to fix the damage and steer this whole program back towards its original goals. And the recommendations are really just common sense. First, bring back E10 fuel as a protection fuel for all those older vehicles, and mandate clear labeling at every single pump so people actually know what they're putting in their tank.
And crucially, you have to price E20 lower to actually make up for the mileage loss consumers are facing. For the long haul, the only truly sustainable path is to get away from food crops and push hard for what's called second-generation ethanol, which is made from agricultural waste.
And finally, a big one. To rebuild public trust, the government needs to release the full, unredacted test reports on vehicle durability. Transparency is absolutely essential here. All of which leaves us with this final thought. The E20 mandate is a perfect example of a policy with great intentions colliding with a very complex, messy, on-the-ground reality. The real challenge now is whether the policy can be smart enough and flexible enough to adapt to these realities, or if its green ambitions are just going to be undermined by the very problems that it has created. The answer to that question is going to define a huge part of India's environmental future.